The warm Arizona sunset painted the desert in shades of crimson and gold, casting long shadows across the charred remains of the Pleasant Valley farm. Sarah Mitchell stood among the ashes of her life's work, her father's old Colt Peacemaker heavy in her hands as she watched dark smoke still rising from the smoldering ruins. At 42, she had already endured more loss than most. First her husband in the war, now this. But what the thugs who burned her farm didn't know, what no one in Pleasant Valley knew, was that Sarah Mitchell had been born Sarah Thorne, daughter of the most feared gunslinger the Western Territories had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pleasant Valley shimmered in the late summer heat, the Arizona Territory's unforgiving sun beating down on Sarah Mitchell's farmland. At first glance, the modest spread looked like any other struggling homestead. A weathered farmhouse, a sturdy barn, and fields of corn stretching toward the distant mountains. But Sarah had made something special here, turning her dead husband's failing farm into the valley's most productive operation through sheer determination and an uncanny talent for working the land. Her success hadn't gone unnoticed. The Black River Mining Company had been buying up farms throughout the valley, their operations creeping closer to Pleasant Valley with each passing month. Their methods grew less subtle with each acquisition. First came the offers, then the threats, and finally the accidents that seemed to plague any farmer who refused to sell. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow as she checked the irrigation channels. Her practical work dress couldn't hide the quiet strength in her bearing. To her neighbors, she was simply Thomas Mitchell's widow, the stubborn woman who'd refused every offer for her land. What none of them knew was that her success wasn't just about farming skill or determination. The Thorne family had once controlled every major water source from Tucson to the Mexican border, not through force alone, but through a deep understanding of the land's hidden resources. Sarah's father, James Deadeye Thorne, hadn't just been a legendary gunfighter. He'd been a master of territory control, using his knowledge of hidden springs and underground waterways to maintain power in the harshest desert environments. Mrs. Mitchell, young Tommy Garcia, their teenage ranch hand, came running from the direction of the main road. "Riders coming, 5 of them, led by that Davidson fellow from the mining company." Sarah straightened, unconsciously falling into the alert stance her father had drilled into her since childhood. Get Maria and help her secure the barn. Then find Carlos and tell him to watch the back property line. As Tommy rushed to comply, Sarah felt something stirring in her blood, an awareness she'd spent 20 years trying to forget. William Davidson emerged from the heat haze, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as out of place. In the dusty valley, 4 hard-looking men flanked him, their gun belts riding low in the style of hired killers. Sarah recognized their type immediately, though she pretended not to notice how they spread out to cover all angles of approach. "Mrs. Mitchell," Davidson called out, his tone perfectly cordial, despite the threat implicit in his companion's positioning. "Beautiful day for farming, though it must be difficult managing such a large operation on your own." "Mr. Davidson," Sarah kept her voice neutral, though her fingers itched for the peacemaker hidden in the house. "I wasn't expecting another visit so soon. My answer hasn't changed since last week." Davidson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The situation has changed, ma'am. We've discovered some irregularities in the original land grants. It seems the water rights you've been using might not be as secure as you thought." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle over her, a clarity of thought she hadn't experienced since she'd left her father's house. Davidson was lying. She knew every detail of Pleasant Valley's water rights because she understood something he didn't. The visible streams and wells were just the surface. Below ground lay a network of ancient waterways that her father had mapped decades ago, knowledge he'd passed to her, along with other deadlier skills. My rights are perfectly secure, Mr. Davidson, though I'm sure the Territorial Office would be interested in examining your company's claims just as carefully. One of Davidson's men, a scarred individual with dead eyes, shifted his hand closer to his gun. Sarah noticed the movement without seeming to, her mind automatically cataloguing angles and distances just as she'd been taught. They weren't here. In for a peaceful negotiation. The timing was wrong, and their positioning spoke of violence to come. That's the problem with women trying to run businesses, Davidson sighed, dropping all pretense of courtesy. They don't understand how things really work. We're taking control of all water rights in this valley, one way or another. The smart folks have already sold. The stubborn ones. He gestured at his armed companions. Well, accidents happen. Sarah met his gaze steadily, showing nothing of the tactical calculations running through her mind. These men were used to intimidating ordinary farmers. They had no idea they were threatening someone who'd learned strategy and gunfighting from the man who'd once outshot Doc Holliday himself. You have until sundown tomorrow to reconsider our offer, Davidson announced, already turning his horse. After that, we can't be responsible for any unfortunate events that might occur. As they rode away, Sarah remained outwardly calm while her mind raced with plans. She'd spent 20 years building a new life, trying to escape her father's violent legacy. But as she watched dust devils dance across her threatened land, she knew the time for hiding was over. "Tommy!" she called to the young ranch hand who'd reappeared at her side. "Ride into town. Tell Sheriff Morgan I'd like to discuss some concerns about the mining company." She paused, then added, "And stop by the telegraph office. Send a message to J. Thorne in Tombstone. Just 3 words, Sarah needs you." The boy rushed to comply, not understanding the significance of the message he carried. Sarah watched him go, feeling the weight of her father's teachings settling back onto her shoulders. She'd chosen peace for 20 years, but she was still her father's daughter. Davidson and his men had no idea they weren't just threatening a widow's farm. They were awakening something that had been sleeping in the Arizona desert for 2 decades. Behind her weathered farmhouse, hidden beneath innocent-looking storage boxes, lay her father's old gun chest. Inside rested not just weapons, but detailed maps of every hidden spring and underground river in 3 territories. The Thorne family hadn't maintained their power through violence alone. They'd controlled the very lifeblood of the desert itself. Sarah Mitchell stood watching the sunset paint Pleasant Valley in deepening shadows, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything would change. The quiet farmer's widow was about to remind the territory why the name Thorne had once made even the most hardened gunfighters think twice about causing trouble in the Arizona desert. Sarah strode to her farmhouse porch, each step measured and deliberate. The evening brought a coolness that belied the heat building in her chest. Through the kitchen window, she could see Maria, her housekeeper of 10 years, pretending to work while stealing worried glances at the yard where Davidson's men had stood. The farmhouse held secrets that even Maria didn't know about. Behind the root cellar's back wall, a hidden room housed more than just her father's weapons. There were ledgers documenting water rights dating back 30 years, carefully preserved letters revealing corrupt deals between mining companies and territorial officials, and most importantly, her father's personal journal detailing every hidden water source in Pleasant Valley. "Mrs. Mitchell," Carlos, her foreman, approached from the barn. A veteran of the range wars further north, he had an uncanny sense for trouble. "Those men, they're not just company thugs. I recognized one of them, Jake Reeves. He rode with the Clayton gang before they were wiped out. He's a killer." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Davidson's getting desperate. The mining company's running out of water for their operations up north. They need our underground springs. She caught herself too late, seeing Carlos's questioning look at her use of underground springs, knowledge that wasn't supposed to be common, but Carlos was too diplomatic to question her slip. Instead, he said, "Tommy's back from town. Sheriff Morgan wasn't in his office. His deputy said he's been meeting with mining company lawyers all week." Of course he had. Sarah remembered her father's teachings about corruption, how it spread, like poison in a well, contaminating everything it touched. The mining company wouldn't have moved this aggressively without ensuring local law enforcement would look the other way. Sarah waited until Carlos had returned to his duties before entering the house. In her bedroom, she knelt beside the hope chest her mother had given her, the one possession she'd brought from her old life. Inside, beneath carefully folded linens, lay a false bottom concealing a single photograph. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside a tall man with steel-grey eyes and a gun belt worn with the ease of a second skin. James "Deadeye" Thorne hadn't just been the fastest gun in the territories. He'd been a master strategist who understood that true power came from controlling resources, not just winning gunfights. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the bedroom window, she spotted 3 riders approaching from the south, ranch hands from the Peterson place, if she wasn't mistaken. Old man Peterson had sold to the mining company last month, after his barn mysteriously burned down. "Mrs. Mitchell," Tommy's voice carried urgency, "the Peterson boys are here. They say they got a message for you." Sarah tucked the photograph away and moved to the porch, noting how Peterson's youngest son, Billy, kept his hand near his gun. They'd been good neighbors once, before the mining company's money turned them. "Evening, Mrs. Mitchell," Jack Peterson, the eldest, called out. "Just passing along a friendly reminder about Mr. Davidson's offer. Be a shame if anything happened to this fine farm of yours." Sarah's response was cut short by the distant sound of galloping hooves, a single rider, approaching fast from the direction of town. The Petersons turned to look, and Sarah saw their faces pale. The rider emerged from the evening haze, a tall figure on a dark horse, moving with the fluid grace that marked a true horseman. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized the distinctive pearl-handled revolvers at the stranger's hips. The Petersons didn't wait to make introductions, spurring their horses into a hasty retreat. They'd never met James Thorne, but every gunman in the territory knew the description of his signature weapons. The rider reined up at her gate, and Sarah felt 20 years of carefully constructed identity begin to crack. Her father's face had aged, but his eyes were the same, sharp as a hawk's and twice as dangerous. "Hello, little bird," James Thorne said softly, using her childhood nickname. "Seems like it's time for some family business." The sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Pleasant Valley. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Thorne, felt the weight of legacy settling onto her shoulders. By sending that telegram, she'd done more than just call for help. She'd awakened something that had been sleeping in the Arizona desert, something the mining company's thugs weren't prepared to face. Tomorrow would bring violence. There was no avoiding that now, but it wouldn't be the simple kind of violence Davidson's men understood. The Thornes hadn't maintained their power through force. Alone, they'd been masters of strategy, experts at using their enemies' assumptions against them. As night fell over Pleasant Valley, Sarah led her father into the house, already feeling tactical options unfolding in her mind. Davidson and his men thought they were dealing with a helpless widow. They were about to learn that some legends don't die, they just wait for the right moment to return. The dawn light crept across Pleasant Valley, revealing James Thorne studying his daughter's farmland through a brass spyglass. His weathered face showed no emotion as he tracked the movements of mining company men positioning themselves along the valley's key water access points. They're setting up just like you said, Sarah observed, joining her father on the farmhouse's hidden observation platform, a clever addition she'd built into the attic years ago. 3 groups, main force at the reservoir, smaller units at the creek crossings. James lowered the spyglass, his steel-grey eyes narrowing. Davidson's no fool. He's got 30 men out there using standard military tactics. He turned to his daughter. But he doesn't know what we know about this land. Sarah unrolled a yellowed map on the platform's small table. The document showed more than just Pleasant Valley's visible water sources. It revealed an intricate network of underground springs and ancient waterways that her father had mapped decades ago. The mining company's geologist found traces of the main aquifer, she explained, pointing to recent excavation marks near the valley's northern edge. But they don't understand the full system. These underground channels connect everything. Control these 3 points. Her finger traced specific locations, and you control all the water in Pleasant Valley. James nodded approvingly. You've kept up with your studies, good. Now, about those men Davidson hired. Jake Reeves is their tactical leader, Sarah confirmed. Run-ins with the law in Texas and New Mexico. He's got a reputation for being methodical, thorough, and predictable, James added. I crossed paths with him in '82. He always secures high ground first, places his best shots where they can cover the most territory. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, just like he's doing now, on that ridge above your north pasture. Sarah felt old instincts awakening as she studied the enemy positions. Her father had trained her to think 3 moves ahead, to see patterns in enemy behavior that revealed their plans and their weaknesses. They're expecting resistance, she mused, but they're looking in the wrong places. All their preparations. Assume we'll fight to protect the visible water sources. A knock at the trapdoor interrupted their planning. Mrs. Mitchell? Carlos's voice carried urgency. Riders coming in from town. Looks like Sheriff Morgan himself this time. Sarah and James exchanged knowing looks. The mining company wouldn't waste time now that they'd shown their hand. The sheriff's arrival meant the next phase was beginning. Stay up here, Sarah told her father. Let's not show all our cards yet. She descended to find Sheriff Morgan already, dismounting in her yard, 5 deputies spreading out behind him. The sheriff's usually genial face was set in grim lines. Sarah, he began, not bothering with pleasantries, got some disturbing reports. Mining company claims you've been diverting water illegally, threatening their operations. He shifted uncomfortably. They've got papers from the territorial office. I need to inspect your water usage, check your wells. Sarah noted how his deputies positioned themselves, not to protect her property, but to contain any resistance. The mining company's influence ran deep. Of course, Sheriff, she replied calmly. I keep all my water rights documentation in order, though I'm curious about one thing. She met his eyes steadily. Did Mr. Davidson mention how many armed men he's moved onto my property boundaries this morning, or why Jake Reeves, a known killer, is commanding them? Morgan's face reddened. Now, Sarah, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The mining company has legitimate security concerns. Indeed they do. The new voice carried absolute authority. James Thorne emerged from the farmhouse, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming in the morning sun. Sheriff Morgan, been a long time. The change in the law officer's demeanor was immediate. His face went pale and his hand froze halfway to his gun. Thorne, but you're dead. The papers said... Papers say a lot of things, James replied mildly. Like those documents claiming my daughter's water rights are invalid. Interesting timing. On those, wouldn't you say? The sheriff's deputies looked uncertain, several backing away slightly. James Thorne's reputation wasn't just about his skill with a gun. It was his tactical brilliance that had made him truly dangerous. This is still official business, Morgan managed, though his voice had lost its authority. The mining company has legal claims. That can be properly reviewed by the territorial court, Sarah interrupted smoothly. I'm sure you'll want to examine all the documentation carefully, including, she added meaningfully, the evidence of certain financial transactions between mining company officials and local law enforcement. Morgan's face went from pale to ashen. James Thorne's reputation for gathering damaging information had been as feared as his gunfighting skills. I'll need to consult with the territorial office, the sheriff said stiffly. Make sure all the paperwork is in order. Sarah watched them retreat, noting how quickly the deputies abandoned their threatening positions. But this was just the opening move in a larger game. Davidson won't take this lying down, she observed, as the lawman vanished into the morning haze. He's invested too much. James was already scanning the ridgelines through his spyglass again. No, he won't. Reeves is shifting his men, tightening their positions. He lowered the glass, his expression thoughtful. But he's still thinking like a military man, preparing for a direct confrontation. While we're going to show him something completely different, Sarah finished, her mind already working through the strategy they'd developed during the night. The sun climbed higher over Pleasant Valley as father and daughter refined their plans. The mining company had numbers, weapons, and corrupt officials on their side, but the Thornes had something more valuable, generations of knowledge about the land itself and the strategic brilliance to use that knowledge in ways their enemies couldn't imagine. Sarah checked her father's old peacemaker, now riding at her hip. The familiar weight reminded her of long-ago lessons in strategy and survival. Davidson thought he was facing a stubborn widow and a legendary gunfighter. He was about to learn that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who could outthink you, not just outshoot you. High on the ridge, Jake Reeves watched the sheriff's departure through his own spyglass. The appearance of James Thorne complicated things, but Reeves had faced legends before. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't just facing two skilled opponents. He was about to encounter a kind of strategic thinking that had once made the Thorne name feared throughout the territories. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was about to begin, and it would be fought with wisdom as much as weapons. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah made her way to the hidden cave entrance behind the old oak grove. Her father's maps had revealed more than just water sources. They showed an intricate network of natural passages running beneath Pleasant Valley, channels that the Thorne family had used for decades to move unseen through their territory. "Carlos," she called softly, finding her foreman waiting in the shadows. "What news from town?" "Davidson's brought in more men," he reported. "But there's something else. Been asking questions about your father, about the old days. Some of his newer hands got spooked when they heard who they're really facing." Sarah smiled slightly. James Thorne's reputation was already working in their favor, making their enemies cautious. But reputation alone wouldn't win this fight. "Show me what you found in the northern passage," she instructed, lighting a lantern as they moved deeper. Into the cave system, the tunnels opened into a larger chamber where the sound of running water echoed off ancient stone walls. Carlos pointed to recent tool marks in the rock. Mining company's tunneling operation came within 10 feet of this chamber, he explained. "They have no idea it exists, but one good blast could breach the wall." Sarah studied the marks carefully. "They're following the water table, trying to map the underground sources." She touched the damp stone. "If they break through here, they'd flood their own operation," Carlos finished. "The pressure from this underground river would destroy their excavation." This was the kind of knowledge that had made the Thornes powerful, not just understanding the land's secrets, but knowing how to use them strategically. Sarah's mind was already formulating plans, seeing how this discovery could shift the entire conflict. Back at the farmhouse, James Thorne was engaged in psychological warfare of his own. Standing in plain view on the porch, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming, he knew Jake Reeves would be watching through a spyglass from the ridge. He'll be remembering Painted Rock, James explained to Tommy, who brought him coffee. Back in '82, I turned his own men against him by making them think their positions were compromised. Fear does strange things to hired guns. The young ranch hand absorbed this lesson eagerly. Like many in Pleasant Valley, he'd grown up hearing whispered stories about the Thorne family's strategic brilliance. As evening approached, Sarah emerged from the cave system with more than just information. She carried her father's old saddlebags, filled with documents that had been preserved in the dry caverns for decades. Davidson's not the first to try controlling this valley through water rights, she told her father, spreading yellowed papers on the kitchen table. The Carlson mining outfit tried the same thing in '75. Your maps show how they failed. James examined the documents with approval. History repeats itself. The same mistakes, the same assumptions about how water flows through this land. He looked up at his daughter. You've done more than just preserve these records. You've added to them. Sarah nodded. 20 years of quiet observation had given her intimate knowledge of Pleasant Valley's hidden hydrology. She'd expanded on her father's work, mapping new channels and understanding how the underground water system had changed over time. The sun, sinking toward the western mountains, painted the valley in shades of amber and gold, but none of Davidson's men had made a move. They were waiting, growing increasingly uncertain as James Thorne's presence forced them to reconsider their assumptions about what they faced. Tomorrow, Sarah said softly, studying the latest reports from their observers. They'll have to move tomorrow. The mining operation up north is running critically low on water. Davidson can't afford to wait. Her father agreed. Reeves will try something elaborate, multiple coordinated attacks, probably around dawn. He always loved complexity. A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. Never understood that the simplest solutions are often the most effective. As night fell over Pleasant Valley, Sarah and James refined their strategy. The mining company thought they were facing a straightforward confrontation. A legendary gunfighter and his daughter defending their land. They had no idea they were dealing with something far more sophisticated. Generations of accumulated knowledge about the land itself, combined with tactical brilliance that had once made the Thorne name legendary. Tomorrow would bring violence, but not the kind Davidson's men expected. The real battle wouldn't be fought with guns alone, but with understanding of how water moved through hidden channels, how pressure built up in underground rivers, and how the land itself could become a weapon in the hands of those who truly knew its secrets. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter prepared for what was to come, knowing that their greatest advantage lay not in force of arms, but in the wisdom passed down through generations of strategic thinking. Davidson was about to learn why the Thorne name had once commanded respect throughout the territories, not just for skill with a gun, but for the ability to turn an enemy's strength into their greatest weakness. The pre-dawn darkness settled over Pleasant Valley like a heavy blanket, broken only by the faint flicker of lamplight from Sarah's farmhouse. Inside, final preparations were underway. Sarah and James Thorne moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and reviewing their carefully laid plans one last time. Through the farmhouse's hidden observation points, they tracked multiple groups of men moving into position around the property. Jake Reeves was coordinating his forces exactly as James had predicted, spreading them out to control key positions around the visible water sources. Main force approaching from the north, Sarah reported, watching through her father's spyglass. 20 men, heavily armed. Reeves has another group working their way through the eastern creek bed. James studied the enemy movements with professional interest. He's dividing his forces, trying to control too much territory at once. Making the same mistake he made at Painted Rock. But Sarah had spotted something more concerning. They're carrying mining explosives. Looks like they're planning to destroy the reservoir dam if they can't control it. A ghost of a smile touched James's weathered face. Davidson's getting desperate, willing to destroy what he can't possess. He turned to Carlos, who had just entered with fresh intelligence. "Are our people in position?" The foreman nodded. "Tommy's got the charges set in the northern tunnel, just like you showed him. Maria's family is ready at the cave entrance. Everyone knows their part." Sarah felt the familiar clarity of mind that came before decisive action. The mining company thought they were orchestrating an overwhelming show of force. Instead, they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The first light of dawn revealed Davidson himself, arriving with a final group of men. He took position on a ridge overlooking the farm, clearly intending to direct operations from a safe distance. Through her spyglass, Sarah could see him consulting with what appeared to be a mining engineer, probably planning how to secure the water sources they thought were crucial. "Here they come," James said softly, as mounted men began moving toward the farm from multiple directions. "Right on schedule." Sarah touched the grip of her father's old peacemaker, but she knew this battle wouldn't be decided by gunfire alone. The real fight would happen underground, where generations of Thorne family knowledge would prove more valuable than any number of armed men. "Mrs. Mitchell!" Davidson's voice carried across the morning air. "This is your final chance. We're taking control of these water rights one way or another. Come out now, and we can still discuss terms." Sarah stepped onto her porch, projecting calm confidence while carefully noting the positions of hidden gunmen. "My terms haven't changed, Mr. Davidson. This land and its water aren't for sale. This isn't about buying anymore." Davidson's facade of civility had vanished. "We're taking control of all water sources in Pleasant Valley. Your cooperation is no longer required." Jake Reeves gave a signal, and his men began advancing on the reservoir dam. Others moved to secure the visible Wells and Creek access points. They were executing a textbook operation to seize control of the valley's water supply. But Sarah and James had spent the night preparing a very different kind of response. As Davidson's men reached their apparent objectives, Sarah raised her hand in a subtle signal. Deep underground, Tommy Garcia pulled a carefully prepared lever. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic for the mining company. The northern tunnel, weakened exactly where their underground excavation had nearly breached the hidden river, collapsed spectacularly. A torrent of pressurized water burst through their mining operation, flooding their carefully engineered shafts and destroying equipment worth thousands of dollars. "Impossible!" Davidson's mining engineer was shouting, studying charts that suddenly proved worthless. "The water table doesn't work like that. These readings can't be right." But Sarah and James were already implementing the next phase of their plan. Maria's family members, positioned at strategic points throughout the cave system, opened and closed hidden water channels that her father had mapped decades ago. The underground rivers responded to their expert manipulation, turning portions of the valley into treacherous ground for Davidson's mounted men. "Pull back!" Reeves was shouting as horses foundered in suddenly muddy ground. "It's a trap!" James Thorne stood on the porch beside his daughter, his pearl-handled revolvers prominent but still holstered. His mere presence sent waves of uncertainty through the hired gunmen, many of whom had grown up hearing stories about his legendary tactical genius. "You seem confused, Mr. Davidson," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the chaos. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss the real history of Pleasant Valley's water rights, the history your mining company tried to bury?" Sarah withdrew a packet of documents from her father's saddlebags, evidence they'd preserved in the dry cave system for decades. "Like these records showing how your company tried the same scheme in '75? Or these surveys proving you've been deliberately falsifying water table data?" Davidson's face had gone pale. The mining engineer was frantically checking calculations, trying to understand how his careful plans had gone so catastrophically wrong. More of his men were retreating from the increasingly unstable ground, but Jake Reeves wasn't finished. He directed a group of his most hardened men toward the farmhouse, determined to take control through direct action. "Burn it all," he ordered. "Take their command position." What he didn't know was that this, too, was anticipated. As his men approached the farm buildings, Carlos and his companions emerged from hidden positions in the old tunnel network, armed, with both weapons and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The attackers suddenly found themselves caught between visible defenders and hidden forces that seemed to materialize from the earth itself. Sarah watched the confrontation unfold with the same tactical clarity her father had taught her years ago. Davidson's men were learning a harsh lesson about the difference between apparent control and true understanding of the land. "Your father was right," Carlos said quietly, rejoining them on the porch. They never thought to look deeper than the surface, never understood that the real power in this valley flows underground. More shots rang out as the last of Reeves's men tried to maintain their positions, but the battle's outcome was already decided. The mining company's carefully planned operation had been completely undermined, literally and figuratively, by the Thorns' superior understanding of Pleasant Valley's true nature. The morning sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the mining company's defeat. Their underground operations were flooded, their men were retreating in confusion, and their carefully fabricated water rights claims were about to be exposed to full scrutiny. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The real victory wouldn't be won through force of arms, but through the strategic use of knowledge that had been preserved and expanded through generations of careful observation and planning. Davidson's empire was about to learn why the Thorn name had once commanded respect throughout the territories, not just for skill with a gun, but for the deeper understanding that true power flows like water, not always visible on the surface, but unstoppable once its real nature is understood. Here's the continuation of Part 4. "Stand down, Reeves," Davidson shouted, finally recognizing the futility of their position. "Fall back to the ridge." But Jake Reeves had staked too much of his reputation on this operation to retreat easily. He spurred his horse forward, drawing his gun with practiced speed. "The hell with water rights. Let's settle this the old way." James Thorn hadn't survived decades as a legend by being predictable. Instead of drawing his famous pearl-handled revolvers, he simply smiled. At that exact moment, the ground beneath Reeves's horse suddenly shifted, softened by carefully directed underground water flows. The animal stumbled, throwing its rider hard. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Look around you, Mr. Davidson. Every piece of equipment you brought into this valley, every survey stake you planted, every camp you established, they're all positioned exactly where we wanted them. You haven't been running this operation. You've been following a script written generations ago." She gestured to the flooding mining tunnels, the muddied grounds that had trapped their horses, the suddenly revealed hidden springs that had turned solid ground treacherous. "The Thorn family didn't just map these water sources. We studied how they change, how they connect, how they can be used by those who understand their true nature." Davidson's mining engineer was frantically reviewing his charts. "These water patterns, they're impossible unless..." His eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Unless everything we thought we knew about this valley's hydrology was deliberately misleading. My grandfather started mapping these underground rivers before the Civil War," Sarah confirmed. "My father expanded that knowledge. I've spent 20 years adding to it. Your company isn't the first to think surface control equals true power." James Thorn hadn't moved from the porch, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to the tension around him. "Davidson, your man Reeves there once asked me why I never seem worried about running out of water, even in the worst droughts. He's about to learn the answer." More hidden springs were revealing themselves, turning the battlefield into a demonstration of the Thorn family's true mastery over Pleasant Valley. Davidson's men found themselves increasingly isolated on islands of solid ground, their tactical positions completely compromised. "It's over," Sarah called out, but this doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Leave our valley, take your operations elsewhere, or stay and learn why no one has ever successfully challenged the Thorn family's understanding of this land. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating a changed Pleasant Valley. Davidson's carefully planned operation lay in ruins, his men demoralized, his hidden agenda exposed. But more importantly, the true nature of the Thorn family's power had been revealed. Not just their skill with weapons, but their deep understanding of the land itself. As Davidson and his remaining men retreated, Sarah knew their victory wouldn't just protect her farm. It would remind the entire territory that some knowledge, passed down through generations and guarded carefully, was worth more than all the guns and money in the West. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter had demonstrated why their family name once commanded such respect. Not through violence alone, but through the wisdom to understand that true power flows like the hidden rivers beneath their feet, invisible to most, but undeniable to those who know its secrets. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pleasant Valley as Sarah and James Thorn surveyed the aftermath of the morning's confrontation. The mining company's retreat had left evidence of their failed operation scattered across the landscape. Abandoned equipment, flooded tunnels, and churned earth where hidden springs had turned solid ground treacherous. But Sarah's tactical mind was already looking ahead. Davidson won't accept defeat easily, she observed, studying the distant ridgeline through her father's spyglass. He's invested too much in controlling these water rights. No, James agreed, but he'll change tactics. Men like that always do. When force fails, they turn to law and politics. As if confirming his assessment, a dust cloud approached from town. 3 riders, led by Judge Marcus Hamilton from the territorial court. Sarah recognized the significance immediately. Davidson was escalating the conflict to a new arena. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge called out as they approached, his formal demeanor barely masking his discomfort. "I have orders from the territorial capital to investigate allegations of water rights violations and possible sabotage of legitimate mining operations." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Of course, Your Honor. I assume you'll want to see all the relevant documentation." She gestured toward the house, including records of certain financial transactions between mining company officials and members of the territorial court. The judge's face paled slightly. James Thorn's reputation for gathering damaging information had extended far beyond mere gunfights. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah withdrew carefully preserved documents from her father's old strongbox. "These make for interesting reading," she noted, spreading out yellowed papers. "Especially these surveys from 1875 showing how the mining company deliberately falsified water table data." But the judge wasn't finished. "There's more, Mrs. Mitchell. The territorial governor is sending investigators. There are questions about your father's original claims to this land." "Are there?" James Thorn's voice carried quiet authority. "Strange timing, considering those claims have been unchallenged for 30 years. Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, seeing patterns in this new threat. Davidson was trying to use governmental authority to accomplish what force had failed to achieve, but he didn't understand what he was really challenging. "Carlos," she called to her foreman, "show the judge our new water management system, the one that's been keeping 3 counties supplied during the drought." As Carlos led the increasingly bewildered judge on a tour, Sarah and James retreated to the hidden command center in the attic. Fresh reports were arriving from their network of allies throughout the territory. "Davidson's busy in the capital," Sarah noted, reviewing telegrams. "Meeting with mining commissioners, bank representatives, territorial officials. Building alliances," James confirmed, "trying to create enough legal pressure to force us out." His weathered face showed grudging respect. Smart move. He knows he can't beat us with guns alone, but Sarah saw opportunity in this new challenge. He's playing right into our hands. Every official meeting, every legal document, every political deal, they all leave traces. James smiled slightly, recognizing his daughter's strategic mind at work. Just like I taught you, power isn't just about force. It's about information, leverage, understanding how everything connects. Sarah spread out a different kind of map. Not of water sources, but of political and financial connections throughout the territory. She'd spent years quietly documenting who owned what, who owed whom, where the real power flowed. Davidson thinks he's building a legal case against us, she explained, but he's actually creating a network we can use against him. Every corrupt judge, every bought official, every manipulated document, they're all vulnerabilities. A rider. Approached at speed, young Tommy returning from town with fresh intelligence. Mining companies calling in experts from the back east, he reported breathlessly. Geologists, water rights lawyers, even some kind of special investigator. Sarah absorbed this information with calm focus. They're trying to discredit our knowledge of the land, challenge everything we've documented about Pleasant Valley's water systems. But James saw deeper implications. They're not just attacking our claims. They're trying to erase our legacy, make it seem like everything the Thorne family built was based on deception. Sarah moved to her father's old desk, withdrawing more documents. Not just maps and water rights papers, but letters, journals, and photographs documenting decades of careful observation and protection of the valley's resources. Then it's time to show them what that legacy really means, she said softly. Not just our knowledge of hidden springs and underground rivers, but our understanding of how power really flows in this territory. Through her network of carefully placed observers, Sarah learned that Davidson had called an emergency meeting of his mining company's board of directors. They were gathering in Phoenix, probably to authorize whatever resources were needed to destroy the Thorne family's influence once and for all. But Sarah had anticipated this too. While Davidson gathered his legal and political forces, she was mobilizing a different kind of power. The trust and gratitude of common people who had benefited from her family's protection over generations. Send word to the Martinez family, she instructed Carlos. Tell them it's time to activate the old networks. Every rancher who survived drought because of our hidden springs, every farmer who kept their land because of our support. Remind them what's really at stake. As evening approached, more riders arrived at the farm, not hired guns or legal authorities, but ordinary people who understood that the real battle wasn't just about water rights. It was about protecting a system of knowledge and mutual support that had sustained their communities for generations. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Thorne, stood on her porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. Davidson thought he was just fighting for control of water resources. He didn't understand that he was challenging something far more powerful, a legacy of wisdom that had been carefully preserved and passed down through generations of strategic thinking. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter prepared for this new phase of the conflict, knowing that their greatest strength lay not in weapons or legal documents, but in the deep understanding of how power really flows through both the land and human society. Davidson was about to learn why the Thorne name had commanded respect throughout the territories, not just for skill with guns or knowledge of hidden springs, but for the ability to see the connections that others missed, and use those connections to protect what truly mattered. Here's the continuation of Part 5. A knock at the farmhouse. Door revealed Sheriff Morgan arriving without his deputies. His face showed the strain of divided loyalties. Sarah thought you should know, Davidson hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They're sending investigators to dig into your family's past. Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with her father. The Pinkertons were known for their thorough investigations and their willingness to use any means necessary to serve their clients' interests. "Let them dig," James said calmly. "The Thorne family's roots go deeper than they can imagine." Sarah led the sheriff to her father's study, where she revealed another hidden compartment behind the bookshelf. Inside lay leather-bound volumes, detailed records of every water rights dispute, every mining company scheme, every attempted land grab in the territory's history. "Our family didn't just map water sources," she explained. "We documented corruption, preserved evidence of illegal dealings, and protected those who couldn't protect themselves. The Pinkertons will find more than they bargained for." Morgan studied the documents with growing concern. "Davidson's stirring up trouble in town, spreading rumors about your father's past, suggesting the Thorne family's water rights were obtained through intimidation." "Interesting," Sarah mused. "He's trying to turn public opinion against us, make it easier for the territorial government to seize our land legally." But Davidson's strategy had an unintended consequence. As his agents spread their accusations, they awakened old memories among the territory's residents. Memories of how the Thorne family had helped common people survive droughts, resist corporate takeovers, and maintain their independence. Through her network of contacts, Sarah learned that support was gathering in unexpected places. Ranch hands, shopkeepers, farmers, people who had benefited from her family's protection over the years were beginning to speak out. "Davidson doesn't understand what he's really fighting," James observed, watching mounted riders approach from various directions. "He thinks power comes from money and political influence. He never learned that true authority is built on trust and mutual support." Sarah moved to her observation post, studying the valley through her spyglass. The mining company's legal and political offensive was mobilizing, but so was something else, a grassroots response that no amount of corporate money could control. "Send word to Catherine Wells at the territorial newspaper," she instructed. "Tommy, tell her it's time to publish those documents we discussed. The ones showing how mining companies have been manipulating water rights across 3 territories." As night fell over Pleasant Valley, Sarah and James refined their strategy. Davidson was escalating the conflict to legal and political arenas, thinking to overwhelm them with corporate resources and official authority. Instead, he was about to discover that the Thorne family's influence extended far beyond hidden springs and gunfighting skills. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter prepared to demonstrate why their name had commanded respect throughout the territories. Not through force or fear, but through the careful preservation of knowledge that could expose corruption and protect those who needed protection most. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was just beginning, and it would be fought with weapons that no Pinkerton agent or corporate lawyer could easily counter: truth, trust, and the deep understanding of how power really flows through both the land and human society. The morning brought 2 Pinkerton detectives to Pleasant Valley, their Eastern suits and careful manner marking them as outsiders. Sarah watched their approach from her hidden observation post, noting how they studied everything with professional attention. "James Thorne's daughter," the senior detective mused, consulting his notebook as they reached the farmhouse. "Records show you left the territory in 75, supposedly cutting all ties with your father's activities." Sarah met his probing gaze steadily. "People change, Mr. Harrison. William Harrison, Pinkerton Detective Agency." He gestured to his younger companion. "My associate, Mr. Cole. We're investigating certain irregularities in territorial water rights claims." What the detectives didn't know was that Sarah had already received detailed reports about them. Her network had tracked their movements since they crossed into the territory, documenting every meeting, every interview, every piece of evidence they'd gathered. "Interesting timing," she observed. Just as the mining company's attempt at force failed, they turned to professional investigators. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're interested in the truth, Mrs. Mitchell, specifically about how your family obtained control of this valley's water rights." "The truth?" James Thorne emerged from the shadows of the porch, his presence causing both detectives to tense instinctively. "Let's discuss the truth, Mr. Harrison. Like the truth about your meeting with Davidson's mining engineer yesterday. The one not mentioned in your official reports." The younger detective's hand moved slightly toward his coat, but Harrison stopped him with a subtle gesture. "You've been watching us." "Just as you've been watching us," Sarah replied calmly. "But while you're looking for evidence of past misdeeds, we've been documenting current ones, like this." She withdrew a packet of photographs from her father's saddlebags. The images showed clandestine meetings between mining company officials and territorial judges, secret payoffs, and carefully orchestrated accidents at farms that refused to sell their water rights. "Impossible," Cole breathed. "These meetings were completely secret." "Nothing in this territory stays secret from the Thorne family," James said quietly. "We didn't maintain our influence through force alone. Knowledge, Mr. Harrison, that's always been our real power." But the Pinkertons weren't finished. Harrison withdrew more documents, old wanted posters, newspaper clippings, court records. "Your family's history of violence is well documented," Sarah interrupted, "as is our history of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Like these." She revealed another set of records. Detailed accounts of how the Thorne family had helped small ranchers survive droughts, resist corporate takeovers, and maintain their independence. "My father taught me that real power isn't about violence," she continued. "It's about understanding. Understanding how water flows underground, yes, but also understanding how corruption flows through society." Harrison studied the documents with professional interest. "You've been gathering evidence for years, not just about water rights, but about every corrupt deal, every corporate scheme in the territory." "Generations worth of knowledge," James confirmed. "While men like Davidson think they're building empires, we've been quietly documenting how they build them. Every bribe, every threatened judge, every falsified survey." The implications slowly dawned on the detectives. They weren't just investigating the Thorne family's past. They were being shown evidence that could expose corruption throughout the entire territorial system. A rider approached at speed, Tommy, returning from town with urgent news. "Mining companies called in federal marshals. They're claiming jurisdiction over all water rights disputes in the territory." Sarah absorbed this information with calm focus. Davidson was escalating again, trying to bring federal authority to bear. But this, too, had been anticipated. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "your agency prides itself on finding the truth. Are you prepared to see where this investigation really leads? Because Davidson isn't just fighting for control of Pleasant Valley. He's trying to hide decades of corporate corruption that goes far beyond water rights." The senior detective's expression showed he understood the choice before him. Continue serving Davidson's agenda, or follow the evidence toward larger truths that powerful men wanted kept hidden. "Show me everything," he finally decided. "All of it." As Sarah revealed more of her family's carefully preserved documentation, a pattern emerged that stunned even the experienced investigators. The mining company's water rights scheme wasn't just about controlling Pleasant Valley. It was part of a larger conspiracy to monopolize water resources throughout the entire Western Territories. "This goes beyond Davidson," Harrison muttered. Studying maps that showed connections between mining companies, banks, and corrupt officials across 3 territories. "This is systematic." "Always has been," James confirmed. "That's why our family started documenting everything. We knew someday the evidence would be needed." Through her network of observers, Sarah learned that Davidson was already moving to counter this threat. More federal marshals were being summoned, political pressure was being applied, and attempts were being made to discredit any evidence the Thorns might reveal. But Sarah had anticipated this too. While Davidson gathered his legal and political forces, she was mobilizing a different kind of power, the accumulated knowledge of generations, preserved by those who understood that true justice required more than just laws and guns. As evening approached, the Pinkerton detectives continued examining the Thorn family's extensive documentation. Sarah revealed another hidden compartment beneath the farmhouse floorboards, containing even more evidence: letters between corrupt officials, detailed accounts of corporate schemes, and maps showing how water rights manipulation extended far beyond Pleasant Valley. "Your family didn't just protect water sources," Harrison observed. "You protected information." "Information is power," Sarah confirmed. "More powerful than guns or money when used correctly." An urgent knock interrupted their discussion. Carlos burst in, his face tense. Federal marshals at the county line, at least 20 of them, led by Marshal Fletcher himself. James Thorne's expression hardened slightly. Robert Fletcher. He was a deputy back in '75 when the mining companies first tried taking control of the territory's water. And now he's a federal marshal working with Davidson, Sarah added. Interesting timing. Harrison studied a particular set of documents with sudden intensity. Fletcher's name appears in these records from '75. He was involved in covering up the mining company's illegal activities, which means he has a personal interest in discrediting any evidence we might reveal, Sarah concluded. This isn't just about water rights anymore. It's about decades of corruption finally coming to light. Through her carefully positioned observers, Sarah learned that Marshal Fletcher wasn't just bringing law enforcement authority to bear. He was bringing a legal team from Washington, prepared to challenge every aspect of the Thorn family's claims. But Sarah had prepared for this too. While Davidson's forces gathered political and legal power, she was mobilizing a different kind of authority, the documented truth about how corporate interests had systematically corrupted the territory's development. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "your agency's reputation is built on finding truth. What happens when that truth threatens the very system you're supposed to enforce?" The senior detective looked up from the damning documents. "We follow the evidence, Mrs. Mitchell, wherever it leads." As night fell over Pleasant Valley, Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Thorne, prepared to demonstrate why her family name had commanded such respect, not through force or fear, but through the careful preservation of truth that could expose corruption at the highest levels. The real battle was just beginning, and it would be fought not with guns, but with evidence that no amount of official authority could easily dismiss. Marshal Robert Fletcher arrived at Pleasant Valley in a cloud of dust and authority, his badge catching the morning sun. 20 federal marshals spread out behind him, their positioning suggesting military training. But Sarah noticed something more significant: the 3 men in expensive suits who hung back, carrying leather briefcases rather than weapons. Government. "Attorneys," James murmured, watching through his spyglass. "Davidson's playing his highest cards now." "Mrs. Mitchell," Fletcher's voice carried across the yard. "By federal authority, we're here to investigate allegations of water rights fraud and interference with legitimate mining operations." Sarah stepped onto her porch, projecting calm confidence, while noting how Fletcher's men were establishing a perimeter. The marshal had changed since his deputy days, but his tactical thinking hadn't evolved, still relying on shows of force rather than true strategy. "Marshal Fletcher," she replied evenly. "How interesting to see you on Davidson's side, especially considering your involvement in the mining company's activities back in '75. Fletcher's weathered face showed the slightest tension. Behind him, the government attorneys exchanged glances. "We have federal warrants," Fletcher continued, ignoring her reference to the past. Authorization to examine all documentation related to water rights in this valley. Any resistance will be considered obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice? James Thorne emerged from the shadows of the porch. Like the obstruction you participated in when you helped cover up the mining company's illegal activities 30 years ago. The marshal's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the Pinkerton detectives chose that moment to step forward. Harrison held up a thick sheaf of documents. Marshal, before you execute those warrants, you might want to examine this evidence. Records showing systematic corruption in water rights administration across 3 territories, including, he added, meaningfully detailed accounts of certain law enforcement officials' involvement. Fletcher's face darkened. The Pinkerton agency works for the mining company in this investigation. We work for the truth, Marshal, Harrison corrected, and the evidence suggests this goes far beyond one valley's water rights. Sarah watched. The subtle shift in power dynamics. The government attorneys were already moving forward, their professional interest piqued by mentions of documented corruption. My family has been gathering evidence for generations, she explained, leading them into the farmhouse, not just about water sources, but about how power really flows in this territory. The attorney's eyes widened as she revealed the extent of her documentation. Maps showing hidden springs and underground rivers were just the beginning. Financial records, correspondence between corrupt officials, witness statements, a comprehensive archive of corporate malfeasance stretching back decades. This is extraordinary, the senior attorney breathed, examining a particularly damning set of letters. Evidence of systematic fraud at the highest levels of territorial administration. All of it carefully preserved, James added, by those who understood that someday truth would be needed more than guns. Fletcher tried to maintain control of the situation. These documents could be forgeries. We'll need to verify every piece authenticated, Harrison interrupted. The Pinkerton agency has already begun confirmation. Dates, signatures, paper types, all consistent with their alleged origins. Sarah revealed another set of records, these focusing specifically on Fletcher's activities as a deputy. Your signature appears frequently, Marshal, especially on reports dismissing complaints against the mining company. The government attorneys were now fully engaged, their briefcases open, taking careful notes. This was no longer a simple water rights investigation. It had become something much larger, an exposure of corruption that threatened the entire power structure of the territory. Through her network of observers, Sarah learned that Davidson was already responding to this new threat. More lawyers were being summoned from San Francisco, political pressure was being applied in Washington, and attempts were being made to seize control of telegraph lines to prevent evidence from spreading. But Sarah had anticipated this too. While Davidson mobilized his legal and political forces, she was implementing a different kind of strategy, one based on her father's teachings about how information, like water, flows through hidden channels. "Tommy," she called to her young ranch hand, "signal our friends at the newspaper office. Tell them it's time to release those documents we discussed." Within hours, newspapers across the territory began publishing carefully selected evidence of corporate corruption. Not just recent activities, but a pattern of abuse stretching back decades. "You can't stop this, Fletcher," James said quietly as the marshal read the first published accounts. "The truth, like water, finds its own level. Always has." Sarah watched. The marshal struggled with the implications. His authority rested on federal law, but the evidence threatened to undermine the very system he represented. "You have a choice," she told him. "Continue serving corrupt interests, or help expose the truth about how power has really been exercised in this territory." Through her farmhouse window, Sarah could see more riders approaching. Newspaper, reporters, territorial officials, even ordinary citizens drawn by spreading news of the revelations. The Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter had transformed their conflict with Davidson's mining company into something larger. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about exposing decades of corruption that had shaped the territory's development. Marshal Fletcher might have come to Pleasant Valley expecting to enforce federal authority. Instead, he found himself at the center of a growing storm, one that threatened to wash away the foundations of power that men like Davidson had built through decades of manipulation and corruption. The real battle was just beginning, and it would be fought, not with guns or badges, but with evidence that could expose the truth about how power really flowed through both the land and human society. As the afternoon progressed, more revelations emerged from the throne family's carefully preserved records. One of the government attorneys discovered documents linking Davidson's mining company to a series of suspicious deaths. Ranchers who had refused to sell their water rights found dead under mysterious circumstances. These aren't just water rights disputes, Harrison observed, connecting pieces of evidence. This is a systematic campaign of intimidation and elimination stretching back decades. Sarah produced another set of records from her father's hidden archives. The mining company didn't just want control of water. They wanted to erase any knowledge of how the territory's water systems really work. My family's understanding of underground rivers and hidden springs threatened their plans. Fletcher paced the farmhouse study, his authority increasingly undermined by each new revelation. If this evidence is correct, half the territorial officials are compromised. More than half, James corrected, spreading out a map covered in careful annotations. Each mark represents a judge, official, or law officer who took mining company money. Your name appears several times, Robert. The marshal's weathered face showed the strain of conflicting loyalties. Through Sarah's window, more riders could be seen approaching, representatives from other ranches and farms, drawn by spreading news of the investigation. Davidson's not just fighting us anymore, Sarah explained, watching the gathering crowd. He's fighting the truth about how his empire was really built. The government attorneys were now fully immersed in the documentation, their initial skepticism replaced by growing concern. One of them, a sharp-eyed young man named Phillips, looked up from a particularly damning set of letters. This goes beyond territorial jurisdiction, he announced. These documents show systematic fraud in federal land grants, manipulation of water rights across state lines. This is a matter for Washington. Through her network of observers, Sarah learned that Davidson was already moving to counter this threat. Telegraph lines to the capital were suddenly experiencing technical difficulties, and there were reports of mining company agents attempting to intercept mail coaches. But Sarah had prepared for this too. While Davidson tried to control official communications, her own network of messengers was already spreading copies of key documents throughout the territory. The truth, like the underground rivers her family had mapped, was flowing through channels the mining company couldn't control. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was transforming into something larger, a confrontation between decades of hidden corruption and the power of revealed truth. And the Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to demonstrate why their family name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. Not through force or fear, but through the careful preservation and strategic release of evidence that could expose how power had really been exercised in the American West. Davidson's response to the spreading revelations came at dawn, not with guns or legal papers, but with something more insidious. Sarah watched from her observation post as a parade of wagons entered Pleasant Valley, printing presses, paper supplies, and a team of Eastern journalists. "He's starting his own newspaper," she observed, studying the activity through her spyglass, trying to control the narrative. James Thorne's weathered face showed grudging respect. "Smart move. When evidence threatens you, flood the territory with your own version of the truth." But Sarah had already spotted something the mining company's men had missed. Among Davidson's imported journalists was Catherine Wells, whose brother owned 3 major newspapers back east. What Davidson didn't know was that Catherine had been quietly documenting corporate corruption for years. "They're setting up in the Old Graham Place," Harrison reported, returning from his reconnaissance. The Pinkerton detective had chosen his side in this conflict, recognizing that the real story went far beyond water rights disputes. Sarah spread out a new set of documents on her father's desk. Not water maps this time, but carefully preserved. Evidence of how previous attempts to control public opinion had failed. In '82, the Silver Creek Mining Company tried the same tactic, she explained. Brought in their own newspapers, tried to discredit anyone who opposed them. But they didn't understand how information really flows in this territory. Through her network of contacts, Sarah learned that Davidson's new paper was preparing its first edition, a lengthy exposé claiming the Thorne family had built their influence through intimidation and violence. "Let them print it," she told her worried allies. "Every accusation they make gives us another opportunity to reveal the truth." Marshall Fletcher, still struggling with his role in the growing controversy, watched the mining company's activities with increasing concern. They're not just attacking your family's reputation, they're trying to undermine the entire investigation. "That's exactly what we want them to do," James replied cryptically. "Sometimes the best way to expose corruption is to let it overreach." Sarah's strategy became clear as Davidson's newspaper began distribution. For every accusation they printed, she released documented evidence that told a different story. When they claimed the Thorne family had stolen water rights, she produced records showing how her family had protected small ranches during droughts. When they accused James Thorne of violence, she revealed testimonies from families he had defended against corporate exploitation. But Sarah's masterstroke came from an unexpected direction. Catherine Wells, pretending to work for Davidson's paper, had gained access to their private communications. The evidence she gathered showed that the mining company was actively fabricating stories, paying for false testimonies, and coordinating with corrupt officials to suppress the truth. "They're doing our work for us," Sarah explained to Harrison as more revelations emerged. "Every false story they print, every witness they bribe, every telegram they send, it all becomes part of the evidence trail." The government attorneys, led by the sharp-eyed Phillips, were building a comprehensive case. What had started as a water rights investigation was expanding into an exposure of systematic corruption throughout the territorial system. "Davidson's newspaper is claiming federal support for their operations," Phillips reported, studying the latest edition. "But look at these telegraph records. They've been falsifying communications from Washington." Through her carefully positioned observers, Sarah learned that Davidson's strategy was backfiring in unexpected ways. His aggressive attempts to control public opinion were drawing attention from quarters he hadn't anticipated. Newspapers in San Francisco and Chicago were picking up the story, asking uncomfortable questions about corporate influence in the territories. "He still doesn't understand what he's really fighting," James observed, watching more riders arrive at the farm. Not just local ranchers now, but reporters from major eastern papers, drawn by spreading news of the controversy. Sarah's network of allies was growing stronger. Catherine Wells had connected her with publishers across the country, creating channels for distributing evidence that Davidson couldn't control. The Pinkerton detectives, led by Harrison, were systematically verifying every document, building an irrefutable case. But Davidson had one more card to play. Through her sources, Sarah learned that he had called in a specialist, a man known for managing troublesome investigations. "Marcus Cross," James said grimly when he heard the name. "He was a Pinkerton once, before they fired him for excessive methods. Now he works for whoever pays most." Sarah studied her father's expression. "You've dealt with him before?" "Back in '79. He tried to frame me for a bank robbery to discredit evidence I had about mining company corruption. James touched his pearl-handled revolvers. He's dangerous because he understands how information warfare works. Cross's arrival in Pleasant Valley marked a new phase in the conflict. He didn't bother with shows of force or legal maneuvering. Instead, he began a subtle campaign of manipulation, spreading doubts about the investigation's legitimacy, creating confusion about which documents were genuine, and attempting to turn Sarah's allies against each other. But Sarah had anticipated this too. While Cross tried to undermine their credibility, she was implementing a strategy that would use his own methods against him. "Your father taught you well," Harrison observed as Sarah explained her plan. "Cross expects us to defend against his accusations. Instead, we're going to let him think he's winning right until the moment we spring the trap." The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to demonstrate why their family name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. Not through force or violence, but through the careful manipulation of truth and perception that could expose corruption's deepest roots. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was entering its most dangerous phase, and it would be fought with weapons that even a master manipulator like Marcus Cross might not recognize until it was too late. Sarah watched from her hidden observation post as Marcus Cross established his operation in Pleasant Valley. Unlike Davidson's other agents, Cross worked quietly, setting up a network of informants and creating channels for spreading carefully crafted misinformation. "He's good," Sarah admitted, studying his methodical approach. "Look how he's positioning his people, not just in town but among the ranch hands, telegraph operators, even the church ladies' social circle." James nodded grimly. "Cross understands that information flows through unofficial channels as much as official ones. Gossip, rumors, casual conversations. He uses them all. But what Cross didn't know was that Sarah had spent years building her own network of informal connections. Every shopkeeper who owed the Thorne family for help during hard times, every ranch hand whose family had benefited from their protection, they formed an invisible web of loyalty that no amount of manipulation could easily break. "He's starting to ask questions about the cave systems," Carlos reported, returning from town. "Seems particularly interested in how we managed to flood those mining tunnels." Sarah's tactical mind saw the pattern immediately. Cross wasn't just trying to discredit their evidence. He was searching for the source of their power, the hidden knowledge that had allowed them to defeat Davidson's initial attacks. Through her carefully placed observers, she learned that Cross had hired local miners to explore the valley's underground geography. He was methodically mapping water sources, trying to understand the system her family had spent generations studying. "Let him search," James advised. "The real power isn't in the caves themselves, but in understanding how everything connects." Harrison, who had been analyzing Cross's methods with professional interest, spotted something significant in the pattern of his inquiries. He's not just gathering information, he's building an alternative narrative, one that could explain away all our evidence as elaborate deceptions. Sarah smiled slightly. "Then we'll let him build it. Sometimes the best way to expose a lie is to let it grow until it collapses under its own weight." As evening approached, more reports arrived. From Sarah's network, Cross had begun circulating subtle suggestions that the Thorne family's water rights documentation might be elaborate forgeries, created using inside knowledge of territorial record-keeping. "Clever," Phillips observed, reviewing the rumors. "He's not directly attacking the evidence. He's creating doubt about its origins." But Sarah had anticipated this strategy. While Cross worked to undermine their credibility, she was preparing to reveal another layer of truth, one that would transform his careful manipulations into further proof of corporate corruption. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was about to enter its most complex phase, where truth and deception would intertwine in ways that even a master manipulator like Marcus Cross might not expect. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pleasant Valley, Catherine Blackwood, widow of the mining company's former owner. She arrived in a fine Eastern carriage, her elegant appearance masking a shrewd intelligence that Sarah recognized immediately. "Mrs. Mitchell," Catherine began, accepting a seat on the farmhouse porch. "Or should I say, Miss Thorne, I believe. I knew your father for more turbulent times." Sarah studied the older woman carefully. Catherine Blackwood had survived the territory's most violent years by being smarter than those around her. Her presence now suggested the conflict was shifting in unexpected ways. "Marcus Cross was my late husband's most trusted agent," Catherine continued, smoothing her silk skirts. "He's dangerous, not because of what he knows, but because of what he's willing to do with knowledge. Like using your husband's death to help Davidson take control of the mining company?" James Thorne emerged from the shadows, causing Catherine to start slightly. The widow's composed facade cracked momentarily. "You always did see more than most, James." She withdrew a leather portfolio from her carriage. "Which is why I brought these. Records my husband kept about the company's real activities. Activities that Davidson has continued and expanded." The documents revealed a pattern more complex than even Sarah had suspected. The mining company's water rights manipulation wasn't just about controlling resources. It was part of a larger scheme to reshape the entire territory's power structure. "Cross knows about these records," Catherine explained. "He's been systematically destroying evidence of the company's true operations. But he doesn't know about my husband's private journals." Through her network of observers, Sarah learned that Cross was already responding to Catherine's arrival. His agents were spreading new rumors, suggesting the widow's evidence was motivated by revenge over being pushed out of company leadership. But Sarah saw an opportunity in this development. While Cross focused on discrediting Catherine Blackwood, he was exposing gaps in his own carefully constructed narrative. "He's getting careless," Harrison observed, studying reports of Cross's recent activities, "trying to control too many stories at once." Sarah spread out a new set of maps on her father's desk, not of water sources this time, but of information flowing throughout the territory. Each mark showed how knowledge moved through communities, how rumors spread, how truth and lies intermingled. In ways that could be predicted and guided. "Cross thinks he's fighting a simple battle over evidence," she explained to her allies. "He doesn't understand that we've been mapping the territory's hidden currents, not just of water, but of information itself." Catherine Blackwood proved to be a valuable ally. Her years as the mining company owner's wife had given her intimate knowledge of corporate operations. More importantly, she understood how power really worked in the territory, not just through money or force, but through the careful control of what people believed was true. "Davidson made a crucial mistake," Catherine noted, reviewing Sarah's strategic assessment. "He thinks buying newspapers and spreading rumors is enough to control the narrative. He never learned that truth, like water, finds its own level." Through carefully placed sources, Sarah learned that Cross was preparing his master stroke, a comprehensive document that would supposedly expose the Thorne family's entire operation as an elaborate fraud. "Let him build his case," Sarah instructed. "Her network, every lie he crafts, every piece of false evidence he creates, becomes another thread we can use to unravel his entire web." James watched his daughter's strategy unfold with quiet pride. She had taken his lessons about territorial power and evolved them into something more sophisticated, a deep understanding of how truth and perception flowed through human society. Afternoon brought more players into the expanding drama. Representatives from Eastern banks arrived, drawn by growing concerns about their investments in Davidson's operations. Territorial officials, sensing the shifting political winds, began distancing themselves from the mining company. Cross is losing control of his narrative, Harrison reported, returning from town. Too many independent voices are starting to question his carefully constructed stories. But Sarah knew the most dangerous phase was still to come. Cross wasn't just a manipulator of information, he was a survivor who had learned to use violence when subtlety failed. Through her observation network, she detected subtle changes in his operation. Armed men were being positioned at key points throughout the valley, not just to watch, but to be ready for decisive action. "He's preparing a contingency plan," James observed grimly. "If he can't discredit the evidence, he'll try to destroy it, and anyone who knows the truth." Sarah's response was to implement the next phase of her strategy. While Cross focused on physical preparations, she was setting in motion something more powerful, the release of truth in ways that no amount of violence could contain. "Your brother taught you well," Catherine Blackwood observed as Sarah explained her plan. "But you've gone beyond his methods. He fought with guns and shadow knowledge. You're fighting with something more fundamental, the power of revealed truth." The Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to demonstrate why the Thorn name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. Not through force or manipulation, but through the understanding that some truths, once exposed, could never be hidden again. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was entering its most critical phase, and it would be fought with weapons that even a master of deception like Marcus Cross might not recognize until it was too late. Sarah's network detected another significant development. Cross had begun moving his most trusted operatives into positions around the valley's key communication points. Telegraph offices, mail routes, even the local newspaper office were subtly coming under his influence. "He's creating an information blockade," Harrison noted, marking the positions on Sarah's strategic map. "Trying to control what gets out of Pleasant Valley." But what Cross didn't realize was that Sarah had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of siege. Her father's old tunnel network wasn't just for monitoring water sources. It provided secret routes for messengers to move undetected throughout the territory. Davidson called an emergency board meeting in Phoenix, Catherine Blackwood reported, her society connections proving invaluable. "My sources say he's seeking authorization for extreme measures to protect company interests." Sarah studied the latest intelligence with tactical precision. Cross's information blockade, Davidson's board meeting, the positioning of armed men, all pieces of a larger pattern that was becoming clear. "They're preparing for something big," she concluded, "something that would make controlling information crucial." Through her carefully placed observers, she learned that Cross had established a hidden command center in an abandoned mining office. Unlike his other operations, this one was heavily guarded and operated with unusual secrecy. "Whatever he's planning," James observed, "he's betting everything on it. This isn't just about discrediting evidence anymore. This is about completely rewriting the territory's history." But Sarah had anticipated even this. While Cross focused on controlling current information flows, she had been quietly distributing copies of the most damning evidence to trusted allies throughout the territory. No matter what happened in Pleasant Valley, the truth was already spreading beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The real battle wasn't just for control of water or even information. It was for the very nature of truth itself in the American West. And the Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to show why some legacies couldn't be erased, no matter how skilled the men trying to hide them. Cross's master plan revealed itself at dawn. A convoy of wagons entered Pleasant Valley, carrying printing equipment far more sophisticated than anything Davidson's newspaper had used. But Sarah, watching from her hidden observation post, noticed something more significant: specialized photographic equipment and document reproduction tools. He's not just trying to spread misinformation, she realized. He's planning to create perfect forgeries of territorial documents. James studied the operation through his spyglass. Look at the men guarding those wagons, former Treasury agents, experts in detecting and creating official documents. Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross had spent weeks gathering examples of territorial office seals, paper stock, and signature specimens. He wasn't just planning to discredit their evidence, he intended to replace the territory's entire official record with his own version of history. Brilliant and ruthless, Catherine Blackwood observed, reviewing the intelligence. If he succeeds, every piece of evidence we have could be dismissed as forgeries, while his fabrications would become the new official record. But Cross had overlooked something crucial. Sarah's father hadn't just preserved documents, he had documented how the territory's record-keeping system itself had evolved. Every change in paper stock, every modification of official seals, every shift in administrative procedures had been carefully noted. "Show me the warehouse records," Sarah instructed Harrison. The Pinkerton detective produced a leather-bound ledger documenting 30 years of territorial supply orders. "Look here. The paper stock Cross is using. It's period correct, but he doesn't know about the hidden watermarks that were added." In 72, more reports arrived from Sarah's observers. Cross had established multiple forgery workshops, each focusing on different aspects of territorial documentation. One team concentrated on water rights papers, another on land grants, a third on court records. "He's trying to create a complete alternative history," Phillips noted, the government attorney's legal mind grasping the implications. If he succeeds, it won't just affect water rights. It could reshape the entire territory's legal foundation. But Sarah had anticipated even this level of sophistication. While Cross focused on creating perfect forgeries, she was implementing a strategy that would turn his own expertise against him. "Get word to Catherine Wells at the newspaper," she instructed Tommy. "Tell her it's time to release those special editions we prepared." Within hours, newspapers across the territory began publishing detailed exposés, not just about current corruption, but about the historical evolution of document authentication in the territorial system. Every security measure, every anti-forgery technique, every procedural safeguard was carefully explained. "You're not just fighting his forgeries," Harrison realized. "You're teaching people how to spot them." Sarah smiled slightly. "Cross expects us to try protecting our evidence. Instead, we're making it impossible for his forgeries to survive scrutiny." Through her carefully positioned observers, she learned that Cross was already facing unexpected challenges. His forgery teams, rushing to complete their work, were making subtle mistakes, using techniques that hadn't been introduced until years after the document's supposed creation dates. But Cross wasn't finished. New reports indicated he had begun moving his most damaging forgeries into position, preparing to plant them in territorial offices where they would be discovered by apparently independent investigators. "He's still thinking like a manipulator," James observed, watching the operation through his spyglass, "trying to control what people believe by controlling what they see." Sarah's response was to implement the next phase of her strategy. While Cross focused on creating and placing his forgeries, she was revealing something more powerful, the human story behind the documents. "Bring me the witness journals," she instructed Carlos. From another hidden compartment came leather-bound volumes containing decades of personal testimonies, ranchers, farmers, townspeople who had documented their experiences with both the Thorne family and the mining companies. "Cross can forge official papers," she explained to her allies, "but he can't forge 30 years of personal histories, all supporting the same truth." Catherine Blackwood provided another crucial piece of evidence, her late husband's private Correspondence revealing how the mining company had first begun manipulating territorial records. The deeper Cross dogs, she noted with grim satisfaction, the more he exposes the very corruption he's trying to hide. Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross's forgery operation was expanding beyond his control, different teams rushing to create consistent alternative histories, were introducing contradictions that any careful investigator would notice. "He's getting desperate," Harrison reported, returning from observing the operation. "Pushing his people too hard, taking shortcuts that compromise the forgery's quality." But Sarah knew the most dangerous phase was still to come. Cross wasn't just trying to rewrite history. He was attempting to erase any possibility of the truth ever being known. Through carefully placed sources, she detected preparations for something more sinister. Cross's men were positioning themselves in document repositories throughout the territory, carrying supplies that suggested they weren't just planning to plant forgeries. "He's going to try destroying the original records," James concluded grimly. "Create a situation where his forgeries become the only surviving documents." Sarah's response was to implement a strategy that even Cross, with all his experience in manipulation, couldn't have anticipated. While he focused on controlling physical documents, she was ensuring that the truth would survive in ways that couldn't be burned or buried. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to demonstrate why their family name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. Not just through preserving evidence, but through understanding that true history lived in more than just official papers. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was entering its most crucial phase, and it would be fought with weapons that even a master forger like Marcus Cross might not recognize until it was too late. As evening approached, Sarah's observers reported new movement in Cross's operation. Groups of his men were dispatched to distant territorial offices, each carrying carefully prepared forgeries and the tools needed to make them appear legitimately aged. "Look at their roots," Sarah instructed Harrison, marking positions on her strategic map. "They're not just targeting random offices. They're following the old Thorne family trade routes, the same paths my father used to distribute evidence of corporate corruption." James studied the pattern with growing concern. "Cross has been studying our methods, trying to understand how we maintained our influence across such vast territories." But what Cross didn't realize was that the trade routes themselves told a story, one that his forgeries couldn't explain. Every stop along those paths represented a community that had benefited from the Thorne family's protection, a place where living memories contradicted his fabricated history. "He's making another crucial mistake," Catherine observed. "Focusing on paper evidence while ignoring the human element. Every ranch hand, every shopkeeper, every settler along those routes knows the real history of how water rights were protected in this territory." Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross had established a sophisticated coding system for his operatives, specific signals to coordinate the simultaneous placement of forged documents throughout the territory. "He wants them all discovered at once," Harrison explained. "Create an overwhelming wave of apparent evidence that would be too powerful to question." But Sarah's counter-strategy was already in motion. While Cross's men moved along visible routes, her own network was activating decades-old connections, people whose families had kept records of their own, documenting how the Thorne family had helped them resist corporate takeovers. "Every forgery he plants," she told her allies, "will face not just technical scrutiny, but the living memory of entire communities. You can forge a document, but you can't forge 30 years of shared history." The real battle wasn't just for control of official records, it was for the very memory of how power had been exercised in the American West. and the quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to show why some truths couldn't be erased, no matter how perfect the forgeries trying to hide them. The first light of dawn revealed an unexpected development in Pleasant Valley. Cross's forgery operation had gone silent overnight, his workshops seemingly abandoned. But Sarah, studying the situation through her father's spyglass, recognized the tactical deception. "He's moved underground," she observed, noting subtle signs of activity beneath the apparently deserted buildings, using the old silver mine tunnels. James nodded grimly. "Smart. The mine tunnels connect to every major settlement in the territory, perfect for distributing forged documents without being seen." But what Cross didn't know was that Sarah had spent years mapping more than just water sources. Her father's old journals contained detailed surveys of every underground passage in the territory, including forgotten connections that even the mining company had abandoned. "Look at this," Harrison called, examining fresh intelligence from their observers. Cross's men aren't just carrying forgeries, they're moving printing equipment into the tunnels. Catherine Blackwood, reviewing the reports, spotted something significant. These supply manifests. They're ordering specialized inks and papers from the same Eastern companies that provide materials to the territorial offices. "He's not just creating forgeries anymore," Sarah concluded. "He's establishing a shadow documentation system. Every new territorial record will have a corresponding fake version, carefully crafted to support Davidson's claims." Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross had recruited former government clerks, men who knew every detail of official record-keeping procedures. His underground operation wasn't just copying existing documents, it was preparing to create perfect counterfeits of every new territorial record. "This goes beyond water rights," Phillips observed, the government attorney's face grave. "He's trying to create an alternative version of reality, one document at a time." But Sarah had anticipated even this level of sophistication. While Cross focused on physical documents, she was implementing a strategy that would undermine the very foundation of his operation. "Send word to the Martinez family," she instructed Carlos. "Tell them to activate the old witness networks." Throughout the territory, families who had benefited from Thorne family protection began sharing their personal records. Letters, diaries, photographs that documented decades of interaction with both the Thornes and the mining companies. "Cross can forge official papers," Sarah explained to her allies, "but he can't forge the collective memory of entire communities." Through carefully placed observers, she detected growing frustration in Cross's operation. His forgers, working to create consistent alternative histories, were finding it impossible to account for the flood of personal testimonies emerging from seemingly every settlement. "He's losing control of the narrative," Harrison reported, returning from surveillance of the underground workshops. "Every fake document they create is contradicted by dozens of personal records." But Cross wasn't finished. New intelligence suggested he was preparing something unprecedented, a coordinated effort to introduce forged documents into the territorial archives while simultaneously destroying selected original records. "He's planning to rewrite history at its source," James concluded, studying the pattern of his agent's movements, replace the territory's official memory with his own version. Sarah's response was to implement the most daring phase of her strategy. While Cross focused on official archives, she was revealing the existence of a different kind of historical record, one that had been carefully preserved by those who understood that truth needed more protection than just government paperwork. "Bring me the shadow archives," she instructed Tommy. From hidden caches throughout Pleasant Valley came boxes of documents, copies of official records that her father had systematically preserved, each authenticated by multiple witnesses, and protected by a network of ordinary people who understood their importance. "Your father saw this coming decades ago. Catherine observed, examining the carefully organized materials. He knew someday someone would try to erase the truth about how power really worked in this territory. Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross's operation was facing unexpected resistance. In every settlement where his agents tried to plant forged documents, they found local residents already alert and watching, armed with their own records that contradicted his fabrications. "He's fighting more than just paper trails now," Harrison noted with professional admiration. "He's up against the living memory of the entire territory." But Sarah knew the most dangerous phase was still to come. Cross wasn't a man to accept defeat easily, and his skills at manipulation extended beyond mere document forgery. Through carefully placed sources, she detected preparations for something more sinister. His agents were gathering information about every person who had come forward with contradicting records, building dossiers that could be used for intimidation or blackmail. "He's shifting tactics," James warned. "If he can't control the documents, he'll try to silence the witnesses." Sarah's response was to implement a strategy that even Cross, with all his experience in manipulation, couldn't have anticipated. While he focused on threatening individuals, she was revealing the true strength of her father's legacy. Not just preserved documents, but a network of mutual protection that had grown stronger through generations of shared resistance against corporate power. The Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter were about to demonstrate why the Thorn name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. Not just through preserving evidence, but through building connections between people who understood that true history lived in more than just official papers. The real battle for Pleasant Valley was entering its most crucial phase, and it would be fought with weapons that even a master manipulator like Marcus Cross might not recognize until it was too late. As evening settled over Pleasant Valley, Sarah's observers reported a subtle shift in Cross's underground operation. His forgers were now working frantically, making mistakes that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "Look at these latest forgeries," Harrison said, examining intercepted documents. "The paper's right, the seals are perfect, but they're mixing updates, creating records of events that couldn't have happened when they claimed." Catherine Blackwood studied the documents with experienced eyes. "They're losing track of their own deceptions, trying to maintain too many false narratives at once." Through her network, Sarah learned that Cross had begun disposing of earlier forgeries, destroying evidence of his own operation's evolution. But in his haste to cover his tracks, he was leaving traces that told their own story. "He's panicking," James observed, "making the same mistake he accused us of, leaving a trail that proves deliberate deception." Sarah's tactical mind saw the opportunity in this development. While Cross scrambled to maintain control of his forgery network, she was implementing the next phase of her strategy. "Send word to the newspaper offices," she instructed Tommy. "Tell them to begin publishing the comparative analyses we prepared." Within hours, papers across the territory began printing detailed examinations of document authentication techniques, teaching readers how to spot the subtle inconsistencies in Cross's forgeries. Every mistake his rushed operation made became another piece of evidence exposing the scale of his deception. "He's trapped himself," Phillips noted with legal precision. "The more he tries to cover his tracks, the more evidence he creates of systematic fraud." The real battle wasn't just about exposing forgeries anymore. It was about revealing the true nature of power in the American West. And the Quiet Widow and the legendary gunfighter were showing that some truths couldn't be buried, no matter how deep you tried to hide them. Through the valley's deepening shadows, Sarah could see lights burning in Cross's underground workshops. His operation was working through the night now, desperately trying to maintain control of a deception that was unraveling thread by thread. The truth, like the hidden rivers her family had mapped for generations, was finding its own way to the surface. The dawn painted Pleasant Valley in shades of amber and gold as Cross made his final desperate move. Sarah, watching from her hidden observation post, saw multiple teams of riders converging on the territorial archives in Phoenix. "He's going for everything," James observed grimly. "Not just water rights documents anymore. He's trying to seize control of the entire territorial record system." But Sarah had anticipated even this. Through her carefully positioned network, she'd learned of Cross's plan hours before he implemented it. While his men rushed toward Phoenix, a different kind of power was already mobilizing. "The territorial judge has the documents we sent," Harrison reported, returning from an urgent ride. "Every piece of evidence proving systematic fraud, authenticated by multiple witnesses." Catherine Blackwood, who had spent the night activating her society connections, brought equally significant news. Eastern newspapers are preparing to publish everything, not just about the forgeries, but about decades of corporate corruption in the territories. Sarah spread out her final strategic map, not of water sources or document trails, but of power relationships throughout the territory. Each mark showed connections between corrupt officials, corporate interests, and the hidden channels through which true authority flowed. "Cross thinks controlling the archives means controlling history," she explained to her allies. "He never understood that real power lives in more than just official papers." Through her observers, she learned that Cross's teams had reached the territorial offices. They moved with military precision, securing buildings and preparing to implement their massive document substitution plan. But what they found inside wasn't what they expected. Now, Sarah instructed through her network of signals. Across the territory, a coordinated response unfolded. In every major settlement, ordinary citizens began producing their own records. Decades of personal documentation showing how the Thorne family had protected water rights, resisted corporate takeovers, and preserved the truth about power in the American West. "He can forge official documents," James said with quiet pride, "but he can't forge the memory of entire communities." Cross's operation began to unravel spectacularly. His forgers, confronted with an overwhelming flood of contradicting evidence, couldn't maintain their fabricated narratives. Every attempt to plant false documents was met with multiple authentic records proving their deception. Davidson, watching his carefully constructed scheme collapse, made one final attempt to salvage his plans. He ordered Cross to destroy all competing documentation, both real and forged, creating a void that his version of history could fill. But Sarah had prepared for this too. While Cross's men moved to implement Davidson's desperate orders, she revealed the true extent of her father's legacy. Hidden copies of crucial documents emerged from caches throughout the territory, each protected by networks of ordinary people who understood the importance of preserving truth. "Your father taught you well," Catherine observed, as the strategy unfolded. "He knew someday someone would try to erase history, so he made sure it was protected by more than just paper and ink." Through her carefully placed sources, Sarah learned that Cross himself had finally recognized the futility of his position. His expertise in manipulation had been rendered useless by something he hadn't counted on: the collective memory of an entire territory. The government attorneys, led by Phillips, moved quickly to secure both the authentic documents and Cross's forgeries. "This isn't just evidence of fraud anymore," he announced. "This is proof of the largest conspiracy to manipulate territorial records in Western history." Davidson's mining empire began to crumble as the full scope of his corruption was exposed. Banks withdrew support. Investors demanded investigations, and political allies quickly distanced themselves from the scandal. But Sarah knew the real victory wasn't just in defeating one corporate scheme. It was in demonstrating why the Thorne name had commanded such respect throughout the territories. not through violence or manipulation, but through the understanding that true power flowed from protecting the truth itself. Pleasant Valley transformed in the aftermath. The mining company's attempt to monopolize water rights had failed, but something more significant had emerged. A renewed understanding of how communities could protect themselves against corporate power. "You've done more than just preserve water rights," Harrison told Sarah as the dust settled. "You've shown how truth properly protected can defeat any attempt at manipulation." James watched his daughter with quiet pride. She had taken his lessons about territorial power and evolved them into something more sophisticated, an understanding that the strongest defense against corruption wasn't guns or documents, but the collective memory of people determined to preserve truth. The quiet widow and the legendary gunfighter had demonstrated why their family name had once commanded such respect, not through force or fear, but through the recognition that some legacies couldn't be erased, no matter how sophisticated the attempt. As the sun set on Pleasant Valley for the last time in our story, Sarah Mitchell, Sarah Thorne, stood on her porch watching the changing colors paint the landscape. The battle for control of water rights had evolved into something larger, a demonstration that true power flowed not just through hidden springs or official documents, but through the unbreakable connections between people who understood the importance of preserving truth. Davidson's mining empire had fallen, Cross's forgery network was exposed, and the territory's water rights remained protected. But the real victory was in showing that some things couldn't be forged or manipulated. The collective memory of communities bound together by shared determination to protect what mattered most. The Thorne legacy would continue, not as a symbol of force or fear, but as a reminder that true power lay in understanding how to protect the things that really mattered. Truth, justice, and the connections between people who stood together against corruption. Pleasant Valley had changed, but its essential nature remained intact, protected by those who understood that some fights were about more than just water or land. They were about preserving the truth itself, ensuring that future generations would know how ordinary people had stood against powerful interests and prevailed. The legend of the widow and the gunfighter would be remembered, not for violence or confrontation, but for showing that the strongest defense against corruption was the unbreakable bond between people committed to protecting truth and justice in the American West. In the weeks that followed, more revelations emerged from Cross's collapsed operation. His abandoned forgery workshops yielded evidence of corruption extending far beyond Pleasant Valley, implicating powerful figures throughout the Western territories. "Look at this," Harrison said, examining documents recovered from the underground, tunnels, plans for similar operations in 5 other territories. Davidson wasn't just trying to control water rights here. He was attempting to rewrite the history of the entire frontier. Sarah's network continued to uncover hidden connections. Each new discovery showed how corporate interests had tried to manipulate not just resources, but the very memory of how power had been exercised in the West. They never understood what they were really fighting, James observed, watching as more communities came forward with their own records and testimonies. They thought controlling documents meant controlling truth. Catherine Blackwood, using her society connections, helped ensure the story spread beyond the territories. Eastern newspapers began publishing detailed accounts of how ordinary people had preserved truth against corporate attempts to erase it. "This isn't just about water rights anymore," Phillips noted, as federal investigations expanded. "This is about exposing how power really operates and how it can be resisted." Pleasant Valley itself became a symbol of something larger, proof that communities could stand against corporate corruption when they understood the importance of protecting more than just physical resources. The Thorne legacy had evolved into something new. Not just a story of resistance against power, but a demonstration that truth, properly protected by ordinary people, could defeat even the most sophisticated attempts at manipulation. As autumn painted the valley in new colors, Sarah Thorne, had shown why her family name would be remembered, not for force or confrontation, but for teaching others how to preserve what mattered most: the unbreakable connection between truth, justice, and the power of collective memory. As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of Sarah's victory spread across the territories. News outlets, from the eastern seaboard to the farthest reaches of the frontier, now carried the tale of the widow and the gunfighter who had outwitted one of the most powerful corporate empires in the West. Pleasant Valley became a symbol of our community, armed with little more than its collective memory and unyielding belief in the truth, could stand firm against corruption. But even as the dust settled, Sarah knew that the fight wasn't over. The fallout from Davidson's empire was far-reaching. Investigations into Cross's forgeries revealed links to corrupt officials, judges, and business interests across the territories, and the implications were vast. But the real test would come in how those revelations were handled. Sarah's victory had exposed the cracks in the system, but it was up to the people of the West to ensure those cracks didn't close up again with the sweep of a well-placed pen. "We've started something bigger than any one of us," Sarah remarked one evening to James as they watched the sun dip below the valley's horizon. The weight of their shared history hung between them, unspoken but understood. "We've started a movement," James replied, his voice a mix of pride and the quiet wisdom that had always guided his actions. "And the West isn't the same place it was before. It's going to take more than just us to keep it that way." The Thorne family's name had always been synonymous with resilience, but now it represented something more. A promise that no matter how strong the forces of corruption were, the truth could never be erased. Their fight had become a beacon to the small, often overlooked communities scattered across the frontier. Sarah had shown them all that they could stand up against overwhelming power, not by force or violence, but through the shared strength of their histories and memories. And, in that, there was a power stronger than any weapon. One by one, communities began to follow Sarah's example, organizing local efforts to safeguard their own records, to preserve their own truths. Many even began to document their own histories in anticipation of the next attempt to manipulate them. Sarah's final victory, however, was more personal. She no longer carried the weight of the widow or the daughter of a legendary gunfighter. She was Sarah Thorne, leader, strategist, protector of the truth. And she knew that in the generations to come, her legacy would not just be about the protection of water rights, but about the preservation of the very essence of what made the American West what it was, a land where the stories of its people mattered more than the records that tried to rewrite them. As the seasons changed in Pleasant Valley, Sarah found herself looking toward the horizon, where new challenges would undoubtedly arise. But now, she stood not just as a symbol of resistance, but as a living testament to the power of community, memory, and the unshakable truth. The legacy of the widow and the gunfighter, tempered through decades of struggle and hardship, had been passed down to her, a legacy that would continue, not in the form of might or manipulation, but in the spirit of those who had never given up on protecting the things that mattered most. And as Sarah Thorne stood on the porch, watching the amber and gold of another evening fall across the land, she knew that the battle for the truth was far from over. But with the lessons of the past, the strength of her people, and the wisdom of those who had come before her, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The sun set, but the story of Pleasant Valley was just beginning. The winds of change that had swept through Pleasant Valley were not limited to the legal and political victories over Davidson's corrupt empire. They had touched something deeper, a shift in the heart of the land itself. The landscape, once dominated by the interests of large corporations and powerful landowners, was beginning to shift back into the hands of the people. The Thorn family. Legacy had become a symbol of resistance, but more importantly, it had become a living, breathing movement that was gathering strength across the West. As autumn deepened, Sarah found herself at the forefront of a new wave of organizing. It was no longer just about protecting water rights or uncovering the forgeries Cross had left in his wake. The communities Sarah had fought to protect were starting to come together in ways she had never imagined. Local councils formed, networks of farmers, ranchers, and even small-town shopkeepers rallied around the idea that they could shape their own destinies without the interference of corporate giants. The corporate manipulations that had seemed inevitable now felt like a distant memory, their schemes no match for the strength of these communities united by truth and justice. Sarah's role shifted too. She was no longer merely a strategist and a leader. She was becoming a voice of a new kind of power. She traveled from settlement to settlement, speaking at town halls, meeting with community leaders, and helping to shape the policies that would ensure the integrity of the valley's resources. She was instrumental in drafting new laws, but not the kinds that protected the interests of corporate elites. These were laws that protected the very soul of the land, the water, the soil, and the history that each resident held in their heart. It was Catherine Blackwood who helped Sarah understand the importance of this shift. Catherine's connections in the Eastern media had ensured that the truth of Sarah's battle was known far and wide, but it was her insight into society's wider dynamics that helped Sarah see what they had built. "This isn't just about local control," Catherine explained one afternoon as they watched the progress of the new town hall being built in Pleasant Valley. "It's about decentralizing power. What you've done here, Sarah, is show people that they don't need to rely on one system or structure to protect their lives. They can build their own." The complexities of power, as Sarah had learned, were not just about controlling land or documents. It was about controlling the systems that defined people's everyday lives. Sarah had provided the blueprint for decentralizing that power, and it was already beginning to take hold. Local leaders, empowered by the truth they had fought for, began implementing their own systems. Water cooperatives, regional councils that negotiated with mining interests, and even grassroots education programs that passed down knowledge of both legal rights and survival skills. As these changes spread across the region, the effects rippled through every corner of the frontier. People began to understand that the fight wasn't just about the Thorn family's land or water rights. It was about understanding that the communities themselves were the true guardians of the land. This was a shift that no amount of corporate money could buy, no forgeries could undo. It was a cultural revolution, but even with all this progress, there were still those who had yet to accept defeat. Sarah knew that the mining interests, although weakened, weren't going to give up so easily. Cross and Davidson's defeat had exposed the fault lines in the system, but there were always those who would try to rebuild them. "I'm not done yet," Sarah said to James one evening as they sat together at the family's old homestead, the weight of their victory heavy on both their shoulders. "There are always others looking to take control. The real battle is making sure what we've built here endures." "You've already done more than most could," James replied, his voice steady. "But you're right, this isn't over. There will be other battles, but this time we'll fight with an army of truth behind us." It was a battle of a different kind that Sarah had begun preparing for. This was no longer about confronting corrupt officials or powerful corporations. It was about protecting what had been built by the people of the valley. The work of organizing was far from over, and Sarah had learned over time that true change came not just through moments of triumph, but through the steady, patient work of building something lasting. The people of the West were beginning to understand that they held the power, not through force, not through wealth, but through something far more enduring, their collective will to protect the truth. As winter set in and the valley was blanketed by snow, Sarah stood on her porch again, gazing out at the landscape that had shaped her family's story. The rugged terrain, the sharp peaks of the mountains, the winding rivers, all of it had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the blood spilled over land and resources, and the relentless pursuit of power. But now it holds a different promise. Pleasant Valley was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a symbol of something deeper, a promise that communities could stand up against the corrupt, the powerful, the manipulative forces that sought to erase the truth. Sarah Thorne, the widow, the strategist, and the leader, had shown that when the people came together, they could shape the future in their own image, no matter how many tried to rewrite their history. And as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Sarah's resolve remained unshaken. The battle for truth was far from over, but the strength of the people who had fought beside her would ensure that it would never be erased again. The valley had been changed, and with it the entire West. The legend of Sarah Thorne would live on, not in the dusty pages of history, but in the everyday lives of those who stood beside her and continued to fight for what mattered most: truth, justice, and the unbreakable bond between the people who shaped the land. As the seasons passed, the ripples of change continued to spread through the frontier, and the once imposing shadow of Davidson's empire faded into history. But while the immediate threat had been quelled, the work of safeguarding the future was far from finished. Sarah Thorne's influence had ignited a spark, and the communities in the West, empowered by her example, began to transform the way they viewed power, resources, and their own autonomy. The water cooperatives were thriving, slowly but surely, and regional councils had begun to function with increasing sophistication, helping to balance competing interests in a way that no corporation ever could. The people who had once felt helpless under the weight of big business now held the reins of their own destinies. But Sarah knew that this new way of life could be fragile. Old systems of power didn't fall easily, and while Cross and Davidson were defeated, there were still other forces lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim control. The battle for truth and justice would never be won in a single moment. It was a continuous struggle, one that required constant vigilance. "People think it's over," Sarah said to Catherine one afternoon, as they reviewed the latest developments in a new settlement that had formed just outside the valley. "But the fight doesn't stop when you win a battle. It stops when you've changed the very systems that make corruption possible." Catherine nodded, her sharp eyes assessing the situation with a practiced air. "You're right. The systems that gave rise to Davidson's empire, the ones that let men like him operate unchecked, are still in place in many parts of the territories. If you don't keep pushing, someone else will fill the vacuum." And push Sarah did. It was no longer just about protecting Pleasant Valley. It was about expanding the vision of justice and truth that had led to the downfall of Cross's operation. Sarah's name became synonymous with a movement of people who sought to rebuild the foundations of their communities, who looked at the land not as something to be extracted, but as something to be protected. Her work took her beyond the valley now, into the surrounding territories, where she met with community leaders, farmers, ranchers, and everyday folk who wanted to learn from what had been achieved in Pleasant Valley. Word spread slowly at first, and then with greater speed, as people who had never imagined they could fight back realized that they didn't have to face the world alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.